All righty. Well, thank you for joining us today for this EWA National Seminar Plenary, the COVID slide and what to do about it. It's absorbing all of our time nowadays. I'm Chastity Pratt, the Education Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. First, this session is being recorded. Everything is on the record, chats included. So, also, if you hover over the speaker screen, you should see a button for closed captioning and live transcript. To start viewing closed captioning, click closed caption. To start viewing the live transcript, click live transcript, and then select show subtitle. Also, you're journalists. I know you have a lot of questions. To submit a question for our speakers, use the chat box located in the Pathable platform. You can submit questions at any point during the conversation, and towards the end, an EWA staffer is going to monitor the questions and will facilitate the Q&A portion of this section. Also, we know you like to tweet, and if you're going to tweet about this, please use the hashtag EWA21. All righty, so let's begin. Today we have on our esteemed panel, Emma Dorn, Global Education Practice Manager at McKinsey & Company, our data guru for this conversation. Also, we have Angélica Infante-Green, Commissioner for Rhode Island's Department of Education. I hope I got that right. Wonderful. And Rhode Island recently released a report on how the state is going to address learning loss, so we'll talk about that. Also, we have Sonja Santelises, CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools. She can give us the district level viewpoint of what learning loss and pandemic slide looks like and then how it's being addressed on a district level. So we don't have a lot of time, but we have a lot to get to. I think for this conversation, the three big bucket things we'll be talking about is, of course, learning loss, grades and testing, learning, now how we do that, and, the stimulus. It's a lot of money. So those are sort of the three big bucket things I hope we'll get to. But first, Emma, if you could start us off with providing a quick synthesis of what the data show nationally about learning gaps and which types of data are most useful and reliable. That will get us started.
Absolutely. Can you see my screen? Perfect. And I will try and keep this brief so that there is a lot of time for questions. So the first thing I want to share is a little bit of our own research on what learning loss looks like, where students are, and then I'm going to zoom out a little bit to say how does that compare to others' research, so you get a whole picture of the field. So as the pandemic kicked off, we were immediately concerned about the impact on student learning and what that disruption would be. And we partnered with Curriculum Associates to take a look at their fall assessment data. So these are assessments taken in school in the fall, in the September to October timeframe. And so what these assess is how much students learned in the 2019 to 2020 school year. So those initial school shutdowns that happened in the spring. And what we found is that students had on average learned about 87% of the reading that they would learn in a normal year, and about 67% of the math. And if you kind of translate that into something that makes sense intuitively, that's about a month and a half of reading and about 3 months of math that students were behind where they normally would have been this fall 2020. The piece that really worried us is when we looked at this, there were significant disparities between majority white schools and schools that had majority students of color. And I think that that was really a reflection of some underlying opportunity gaps in terms of access to internet and devices, in terms of access to live instruction from teachers, and in terms of access to actual in-person learning. The other thing I think it's really important to bear in mind as we look at this is that we only looked at assessment results because that's the data that we had. And we only looked at math and English because that's the data that we had. And we have to bear in mind that students didn't just lose English and learning loss due to these school shutdowns. They also experienced some much broader losses, both in terms of broader curriculum, broader skills and capabilities, mental health, and also physical health. There was some really interesting research done by Ofsted, which is the inspection group in the UK, which showed that some students had regressed, were unable to hold a pencil. Some students had regressed in potty training. Obesity rates had gone up. Pupils had gained weight, lost physical fitness. And then we've seen multiple studies around anxiety and depression increasing. We then wanted to take a look at, well, what happens if we try to project this forward? What is the implication if school continues to be disrupted till the end of the school year? And this was analysis we did in December. And so obviously a few more months have passed, but I think we still stand by our projections. And I'm going to be pretty quick in these because we do have a lot to get through. And this is rather a dense slide, but let me talk you through it quickly. So there's obviously still a lot of uncertainty as to what is going to happen towards the end of the school year. And so we did 4 different projections. The first was we just straight line projected, what if we thought that learning loss was going to continue at the same rate as it had in the spring? And for that, we were looking at about 10 months of, students would be about 10 months behind where they would have been otherwise, with students of color potentially being 12 to 16 months behind. Now, districts and states did an awful lot of work over last summer and are continuing to work to improve remote learning, getting some students back to school safely. And so our status quo was everything continues kind of as it was in the fall, was about 9 months. Students would be about 9 months behind in mathematics by the end of the school year. And of course, then there's much that districts and states are continuing to do. And so we then did 2 different scenarios here around what if remote learning was improved, or what if more students were able to go back to school. And we actually have seen many students be able to go safely back to school since January. And now we're looking at 5 to 6 months. Just taking a break for a second, 5 to 6 months is still an awful sobering number in terms of how much students will have lost due to the pandemic. And although students will have gained a lot as well, that we can't minimize the importance of this loss. To the next page. If you try to translate what that looks like in terms of the impact for students for their actual lives going forward, it's about 7 months of learning loss, which is about in the middle of our estimates, translates to $60,000 to $80,000 of lifetime earning loss for the average student. And that means, you know, students some students won't graduate high school, won't go to college, won't get a job that enables them and their families to thrive. And it has an impact on productivity of the country as well. And we're estimating that if nothing is done to help students accelerate learning and catch up what they've lost, we could be looking at $170 to $270 billion of annual GDP loss by 2040 when these students hit the workforce. So those are our estimates. I want to take 1 minute to say there's obviously been multiple estimates of learning loss from different assessment providers. NWEA, Zern, Curriculum Associates, Renaissance, and Amplifier, some of those. And some of those have some conflicting or some different estimates. And I wanted to give a little bit of a guide of how to think through some of that. And so I think there's 4 reasons why estimates vary. The first is in-school versus out-of-school testing. So when you are testing out of school, your testing environment has changed, as well as your learning environment having changed. And so we have most confidence in assessments where the testing environment has not changed, because that's one more factor that we're holding steady. And in fact, a lot of the earlier assessments, the in-school assessments, showed that students had lost learning, whereas the out-of-school assessments suggested they hadn't. And there was, it's hard to know exactly why that would be, but a couple of hypotheses. One is that maybe students were able to focus more when they were out of school and didn't have kids around them. Maybe they were less stressed. Also, maybe parents were helping a little bit, not intentionally trying to cheat, but just, when my second grader shouts out, "Mom, how do you spell sausages?" I kind of yell out, "This is how you spell it." And so I think there maybe was a little bit of that going on. And so fidelity of the testing environment is important. The other thing is that some of these tests have missing populations where they weren't able to capture some populations. And so that's impacting the test scores. Some are using growth versus absolute measures, and then there are different sample sets. I think that what's consistent across all studies, and then I'll pause, is that this unfinished learning is real and it's global. We did a survey of 8 different countries, and teachers across those 8 countries, from Japan to China to Germany to France to the UK to the US and Canada, all said that students had learned on average 2 months less than they would have done in a normal school year. And that was back again in November of this year. So disruption has continued since then. Math is likely worse affected than reading, though there's a lot of concern about early reading. And learning disruptions have just been substantially worse for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, which is really worrying in terms of widening some pre-existing gaps. As I said, losses are not just academic, but broader than that. And I think all of this underlies the importance of understanding where each individual student is, what they know and can do, and also what they need, not just academically, but socially and emotionally from their schools.
Wonderful.
So thank you very much. Happy to answer questions. I think I went 1 minute over. I'm so sorry.
I'm sure one of the questions is going to be, can you share those slides with everyone? But thank you so much for that. Speaking as a journalist, there are some great sources that you shared as far as information on testing results and learning loss, whether it's Amplify, NWA, NWEA, MAP. That's great information. Next, I'm going to ask Angélica, if you could briefly talk about how summer school and the next academic year will or should look different from usual in Rhode Island. If you give us some concrete examples from your report of how things may look differently, and also how do you get districts to commit?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background though. When we went out last March, we immediately started working on how we were going to return. So we actually ran summer school last year, virtual and in person. And we ran it from the state level, which is something that we've never done before. And what we invested in on that we're going to be doing again this summer is really working with the students on what would make them come. Because I think part of the challenge is going to be, how do you really engage the students to want to participate? This has been a long year. So last year we had something called broccoli and ice cream. So you want to take coding class or photography class, great, but you have to take Algebra 1 and you have to do this. And what we saw was very concrete results last summer. So our kids in math that participated in our summer program saw a 50-point gain on their SAT. And for the kids that were already behind, we saw about a 100-point gain in math. So we expect to be able to run that again from the state. This is the first time we've done that, to ensure that our students have this leg up. And the students are helping us create these courses that will run throughout the whole entire summer. The second piece is that when we started in September, we came back almost fully in person. We had a few districts that were a hybrid. We had about 75% of our students in person, and we gave parents the choice. So that for us was a big learning experience. And what we took advantage of is, because we didn't have the state assessment, is as a state with our stimulus money, we brought interim assessments for all our districts. And many of them already had it, but what we didn't have as a state was access to that. The only assessment that we as a state educator have is our state assessment. So we saw a lot of the similar data that Emma presented, but it's a little different depending on how it's administered, but also the assessment, right? So everybody was worried about early literacy, but we definitely saw the gap in math. We definitely saw it for our kids of color. We definitely saw it for our differently able students, for our multilingual learners. These kids, the gap has been even greater. And, you know, for us, I see this as an opportunity, because we weren't in a great place in Rhode Island to begin with. Just wasn't a great place in education. Some of our kids that I mentioned, our most vulnerable populations, were already 2 and 3 years behind. So for us, it's really about thinking about what September is going to look like and what it's going to be different for us, and really blowing up what we think of as education. What, you know, this 8 to 3 hasn't worked for these populations. Having them come into our space has not worked. So what are we going to do differently? And we put together this task force that's called LEAP. It's Learning, Equity, and Accelerated Pathways. We don't want to talk about remediation. We want to talk about acceleration and really be very strong. And everybody's talking about extending the day and summer school, but what does that look like? I'm going to stop talking because I could talk for a long period of time, but it's really reinventing what school looks like. And that's what we're doing. And we're leading. The task force gave us some very strong recommendations and leading from these populations. What happens with these populations is that we usually try to retrofit. This is what we're going to do. And then this is what we're going to do for the kids in poverty. This is what we're going to do for our multilingual. That's not what we're doing. We're starting with that group. And then our responsibility as a state entity is accountability, but also support. So when you asked, how do we get people on board? We've created a template around these recommendations that all districts have to fill out and really present publicly to their community how they're going to serve these populations first and foremost. And that includes the social emotional aspect as well. So it's not just the academic, but all of that. And I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Great, thanks for those examples. Sonja, same question, on the district level, what are you expecting is gonna look different in summer and in the fall? And on a district level, how do you get your schools and your teachers and your families to commit to these changes?
No, it is the same question, Chastity. And I think Angélica highlighted a lot already at the state level. I think at the district level, what we're seeing is, one, our community here has been very clear that they want to be engaged in that redesign. They don't want a kind of packaged product that we roll out and say, we know best. Our community came around our young people during this pandemic. They made sure that they were fed. We had grandmothers and bus monitors who were supervising distance learning before we were back in the classroom. And so frankly, a lot of those folks are the ones who can actually help carry the word as well, if not better, than we can sitting in a central office. So I think that's important. And that's one of the things we've heard. The other piece that I would emphasize is this piece about formative assessments and ongoing assessments. We knew that our state assessments would not be online in any substantial way to be able to provide real-time data. And Emma's work at McKinsey and her colleagues, we've been monitoring that since, frankly, school went down last March. So we were tracking, we already knew what the predictions were. And so very similarly, we put some things in place that we're now going to build on. So for example, in our work with Amplify, we did high dosage tutoring for some of our most vulnerable students. They were virtual tutors, but they were tutors that we recruited from Baltimore, tutors that looked like our kids, tutors that came from our neighborhoods, but that had incredible support. And so one of the early findings we found from that is in cases where young people and their families and schools came around and they actually participated at least 3 to 4 days a week, we saw that we moved, actually during the pandemic, we actually moved kids out of the lowest category at 3 times the national rate, right? So part of what we're looking at is, again, what are the practices that during the last year we've seen work? The other piece is our secondary students were telling us, look, it just didn't work for us. Some of our most vulnerable students were saying, if I have to now choose between a job and logging on or coming to school, got to tell you all, job is going to win every time. And so what that has done is it has frankly forced a system, has forced schools to say, there's a different way we have to engage adolescents, particularly those who have been outside of school. And when we get to this piece about what are the other factors, one of the things that rang true was young people who had strong relationships with adults in their schools, schools that had cohesive professional and family cultures at their school, weathered the last year and a half notably better than schools that did not. So what we heard from young people is, look, when I have a caring adult to connect with, I'm more likely to stay connected to learning. And so part of what we're building on when we're planning the return to school is, how do we make sure that that is in place in a way that is felt and experienced by young people and their families. And then third, I would say, the lift for educators has been incredibly intense this year. And so we, unlike Rhode Island, Maryland took much longer to reopen schools across the state. And so it's meant that, one, we had a lot more ground that we had to cover in just getting people used to being back in person. But similarly, we've had teachers who've told us, actually, I've learned different ways to use the virtual environment that will actually benefit when we return or as we're returning in person. So part of what we're also trying to do is really maximize some of the equity challenges of opportunity that virtual space is provided, right? So increased access to different kinds of coursework for our secondary students, right? So we have incarcerated students that for the first time were able to take college level courses at University of Baltimore. There's no need for that to end now that we are returning to school. So I think it's a combination of building on the best practices, as I think Angélica and both Emma stated, how do we redo school differently, emphasizing the relationship piece and really using the interim assessment data, not in ways that punish, particularly communities of color, that punish kids who were behind before, but changing the conversation to say, how do we work differently in learning from families where their young people are coming? Because it's not just about the score, even on a map, even on an amplifier in EWA. And I always use the example as a mom with kids in the district. If you only looked at where one of my twins was in terms of her academic performance, you would not know that by January, she actually felt kind of depressed. She had been home too long. She was ready to get back. And if you were only looking at a score, you would have missed her. So we're actually emphasizing in Baltimore City full profiles of students so that we have a variety of information, including some of the data Emma referenced, but also the data that you only get from families and you only get from that interaction in knowing where they are with regards to mental health and other things. So I'll stop there as well.
Gotcha. And listening to you, I hear you both talking about some of the best practices that have worked, but just tweaking those to the situation. One big bucket question I have is, okay, crisis situation, we all went through it, we all have to respond to it for the good of our country and our children, but what are going to be the biggest obstacles to educational recovery? Is it going to be the school culture that is going to be a little different now? Is the biggest obstacle hybrid learning, remote learning, getting kids back in the classroom? Is it the social, emotional? Like, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to getting our kids that educational recovery that we know they need right now because of the pandemic? Anything the numbers tell us, Emma?
Yeah, so I think there's just a tremendous challenge. We've been dealing with differences in student achievement for years and years, but we've never dealt with a crisis that has hit every single student in the whole country. And so I think that there's a few things that we need to be bearing in mind. One is just continuing on the funding side. I think we now do have an influx of funding, but making sure that that funding is getting to the students that need it. I think the second piece is just human capital. As Sonja said, this has been a tough year for teachers, and teachers need a break as well. And yet at this very moment is the time where we want to run summer school and we want to run tutoring programs. And how do we just expand the aperture on the human capital that we can bring in to come along students and help them? And then the third I'd say is implementation expertise. There are so many amazing examples of kind of small programs that have had really great results, like the Saga Education Tutoring Program, for example. But they hit, 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 students, and there are 54 million students in our country. And districts and states are understandably slightly overwhelmed right now with the nuts and bolts of getting kids back into school. And now they have to plan the summer, and now they have to reimagine for the fall. And so thinking about how do we create that headspace to both support what students need today, but also do some of that reimagining that I'm hearing very excitedly Angélica and Sonja talk about.
So scaling up what works is always important. But Angélica, if you could talk to us, what do you think the biggest obstacles to success are right now, as you see it?
Well, the biggest obstacle I see is exhaustion, right? Everybody's exhausted, and getting people excited. So one of our recommendations is really having this campaign about coming back to school, reimagining school for everyone, so that everybody feels a level of excitement, because it's exhausting. Teachers are tired, students are tired, and now they've done things differently. Sonja mentioned one of the kids being at work. So we had kids early on at a CVS counter listening to class when we went out in March, because they had to work. So how do we reinvent school? The reimagining, my greatest fear is that we do more of the same, because that has not worked for all of our kids, and it's not going to work. We've entered a whole new world now. So when Sonja was talking about having high school, we had all our high school kids participate in college courses, and that's going to continue. We already have them all registered. So I think that those lines that we had created in the past are gone, right? We created these boxes and these lines, and they no longer exist. And I think that the hardest part for us is really pushing ourselves to go to the next level, right? And not continue to do things as we've done, but really having a strong campaign where we energize the community, the parents, the teachers, everyone. Ensure, we talk about the digital divide, and we were lucky enough to get technology into the hands of all kids, but that has to be updated, and then there's Wi-Fi. There's all these things that need to continue to happen as we move forward. But I think the other piece is not doing the things the same way. Like, when people talk about tutoring, it makes me very nervous. We piloted tutoring for all our 9th graders in the state. But one of the things that we know that is most successful is if the student has the same tutor the entire time, instead of having different tutors. And that's not how usually tutoring programs work. And having it in the home language and having all these opportunities. I think that for us, it's really, we're in a moment right now where we can really do something exciting, something that actually meets the needs of those kids. And when I talk about, when I first came to Rhode Island, I'll give you one example and then I'll move on. I had a kid, a 9th grader, who had to work. Immigrant to the country, had to work and missed his, Algebra 1 class at 8 o'clock. So what happens? Why couldn't that kid take that class at 10 o'clock at night? Why couldn't they take it? Like, why do we keep doing the same things? We keep asking communities that function differently to come into this world that does not work for them. So I think that's part of the work that we have to do. So that's my greatest fear, and is that we only focus on the academics. So we ran summer school in person, and that was really important to get the kids out and running, and they were so excited. The one good thing is that kids are actually anxious to be back in person. Right?
Yeah, it's been a while for a lot of kids. Sonja, what do you think are the biggest obstacles to success? There's a lot of money flowing, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of exhaustion too. What's the biggest challenge to, dealing with what we all see and know is the need for educational recovery?
So I think first, at least from a district level, particularly those of us who have high concentrations of students of color and first gen and low income students, students from low income communities, really is the trust factor. And this just declaring, okay, school is back open, clearly has not been sufficient everywhere, right? So we're excited that when we started, we only had 18% of students back. We're now up to 35%, but 35% is not 100%. And so really it is case making for families, it's case making for students, and it's that trust building in ways that resonate. So for some of our families, our investment in the health protocols, in asymptomatic testing, in making sure we partnered with Hopkins and University of Maryland to make sure our teachers were some of the first vaccinated. But even that is not the full story on trust. When you were looking kind of with misgiving at an institution to begin with, just putting safety protocols in place is not going to be enough. So I'm really focused, and it's part of why we're partnering with our community in how do we build that trust from ground up. And the second piece is making sure that with all of this one-time money that is being, I like to say, dropped, airlifted to major urban centers, that we pace ourselves. We don't try to do it all in one summer. If we didn't get all of the kids back to grade level in a summer, we've been doing robust summer programming for a couple of years. So a lot of our elementary and middle school kids already think of it as like a dance summer combined with reading, right? We've been doing that, but this is about really being strategic. And when I think organizations like Council Great City Schools, Chiefs for Change, have really been emphasizing with district leaders and those of us with colleagues, this is not about plan, $40 million worth of summer school and then drop off of a cliff. So I know in Baltimore City, we are looking at this as a 28-month to 36-month investment. And how are we looking at it over time? How are we giving people time not to be exhausted so that we're reaching teachers when they're refreshed, when they're ready with PD, not trying to jam it all in. So that's my other concern, that if we look at this as a press to show how we're spending all this money without the strategic alignment and the planning, then we really, unfortunately, will have a case for the folks who have never wanted to fund schooling for Black, Brown, first gen students. We're just going to write the story for them, and they'll be the first ones to say, oh, see, money doesn't matter. So I really want us to be strategic about it and look over the long haul.
I know we have a lot of questions from our audience. I got two questions I want to get to really quickly. So we're going to do a quick lightning round here. We've all talked about that stimulus money. You add it all up and it's almost $200 billion, and a lot of it going to, a good chunk of it, most of it going to low-income students. So what's the good use of that money? What should districts stray away from? Angélica, you want to start with that one? What's the good use of that money and what not so much?
Well, so I'll start that with the opposite. What not to, we've been doing a lot of things for a long time. And I think don't do more of the same, right? Unless you've been seeing results with that. Don't, that's my greatest fear, is that then we use this money for remediation as opposed to acceleration. Like that doesn't get us anywhere. I think that that's an important piece that we need to be looking at. The other piece for me that it's really important as a state, as I work with all my districts, is really how are we going to measure what we're putting in place, right? Like what's the accountability around it? We all lived through No Child Left Behind. We lived through money, and here we are, right? Forget about the pandemic, but prior to that, for these populations, we were still lagging behind. So how do you really look at what the research says that works and implement it? And then, everybody's thinking about extending the day, but I'm worried about, do you have a good curriculum? Curriculum matters. Right. Invest in your curriculum, invest in what's happening during the day and extend that. So those are really important. And also give kids opportunities that they would normally not have. That is extremely important. When you put kids in a college course that would have never been there, guess what? They're actually gonna do well if you give them the right supports. So think out of the box, push kids harder in a way where they're actually enjoying it. So think out of the box.
Thinking out of the box. Sonja, here's a question for you. We're all reporters here, and if you were the puppeteer and could just make us write the best stories that we're missing, what should we be writing about now?
I think you should be writing about these plans. I think you should be writing about what the community engagement and buy-in for these plans are. I also think you should be asking questions around implementation. And if I had one area, it would be around the implementation. And, you know, Angélica referenced this. It's great to have the stuff on paper. But 9 times out of 10, where we fall down in education is in implementation and implementation at scale. So those would be some places I would go.
Gotcha. What are these plans? What's the community engagement look like, and how it's being implemented? All good stuff. And now we see Erik has joined us, which means that I'm gonna turn it over to Erik so that he gets us some of the questions from the other journalists.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have a question from Samantha Hernandez. This is for a couple of you, especially Sonja and then Angélica. What are you seeing as far as districts hiring? She calls them interventionists to combat the COVID slide. I'm not 100% sure what that means, but maybe additional personnel of one form or another to help with that.
I will just say I probably need a little clarification with regards to interventionists. We aren't actually, and I haven't really heard from at least a lot of the big city soups that I speak with, and I don't want to speak on behalf of all of them, but I haven't necessarily heard interventionist hiring, so I might need a little more background. Angélica might have a better.
Yeah, so we've heard not so much interventionists, but just people that come in and do these intervention programs, right? And hiring people that, you know, right now this money's not here forever. And one of the other challenges that we have in education is spending all our money on hiring all the staff that then 3 years down the line we cannot keep or sustain, and then we're stuck in this cycle. This is about really strengthening structures. So interventions may or may not have a place. I really don't want to hear anything about interventions in the plans that get submitted to us. I really want to hear about very strong tier 1, what happens in the classroom, and then how do you extend that and provide out other opportunities. So we have not heard that because we have a framework that we are guiding districts away from that practice.
We have a question from Lillian Mongeau of the Hechinger Report. She was asking about, Emma, you had made reference to the data on projections of earning loss pegged presumably to learning loss. And she's asking maybe a kind of simple version of like, how do you do that? What does that look like?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways we did that, and we kind of triangulated. One was we looked at how academic achievement translates into graduation rates, and then how different levels of education, whether you graduate high school, have some college, 2-year college, 4-year college, translate into earnings. So that was kind of one way of doing that story, and that's based on a bunch of academic research on those on that data. There's another way that we did it, which is based on a different stream of academic research that has linked over time achievement in K-12 schools through to actual GDP growth. And that's some work done by Erik Hanishek. And so that was how we got the GDP numbers, is through that impact on GDP growth for academic achievement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ruth Servin at AL.com, an Alabama news outlet, asking about, in places where, there's been issues during the pandemic around attendance and tracking attendance. And as we know, during the pandemic, when students were remote, students who would or wouldn't log on. So the question is, do states have an obligation to enforce better tracking of attendance and truancy? And what can they do to help support students and not just be punitive?
Yeah, so do we have a responsibility? Absolutely. So we've been tracking that data, and part of the plans that the districts will be writing will be really explaining what they're going to do to, one, find the kids if they have not found them, how they're going to engage them, why they haven't been coming to school, and then find solutions around it. We can't make the assumption that we know why they were not engaged. Many of our kids were working. So I think that poses a different challenge. Like, what do we do for them? So this can't be about punitive. This cannot be about, truancy, because that's not what we're talking about. This last year has been very difficult, but we need to know who's been here and who's not. And for us, it's been very transparent. We kept track of our data, and even when some were distance and in person. So we have that very publicly in our website so that everyone can see, and we have to see those initiatives being executed on the ground, on how we're going to actually carry that out. And then as a state, what are we going to do to bring those kids back in?
Okay, thank you. Sonja, did you want to say a word about attendance and how you're kind of addressing that issue in your system?
Sure. No, and again, because we're at the district level, we're pretty much on the ground, and so a lot of it has been everything from we have a traveling bus that has goes into neighborhoods where we have charted that we have the highest concentration of young people either not logging on or attending, and it's really been kind of a wholeness approach. And I think to this point that Angélica referenced, there are many reasons why young people are absent and many reasons why they are not logging on. And so our community school coordinators have been absolutely invaluable because the connection with the family has done that. So we've been charting that data since, I would say, in earnest at the student and school level, probably since the end of October, right? So we've been very kind of focused. We have a weekly attendance stat where literally major players at both the school level and the central level come in and say, where's the data? We know we're getting tighter on that. We're not perfectly there, but we know if this band of students, it's because their Wi-Fi went out. And so we've got to get them a new, hotspot, as opposed to this group of students is struggling with mental health and even mental health from a family member. So what we're really trying to do is get down to the detail of the answer to this question: why are students not connecting? And then how do we get them the supports they need?
I just want to add one piece. So we all own the kids. So I myself have been in families' homes in the living room trying to figure out what's the issue. And one of the correlating pieces for us has been the districts that have been most impacted by COVID. You see the data be very similar. So it's families that their grandparents had COVID, their parents had COVID, there's fear, there's food insecurity, all these kind of things is very correlated with the kids not being in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Sonja, one quick follow-up, because I know you did an interview that I listened to on a public radio station a few months ago where you were saying, there was a lot of reluctance at first for families and students to come back, but as they saw that it could happen and could happen safely, it's really changed. Have you seen, in the time since then, has there been a substantial increase in students and families who are willing to be back in person?
Yes, we have seen it. And one of the things that we've also seen is we haven't experienced the racial ethnic gap that a lot of districts have seen in the return. Actually, our highest demographic of returning families are our Latino families and our ELL learners. Those are the families that have come back the most and kind of consistently. What we have seen across groups is that, and across zip codes within the city, that where families see that it's working, they are more likely to return. So I have yet to visit a school in the city, even some with lower return rates, where they can tell me, Dr. F, we're getting anywhere from 5 to 10 more families each week. For some, it might be 2 to 5, but regardless, across the city, when people see that it's happening safely. When teachers see that it's happening and it's happening safely, then the messaging going home also looks very different. I think our most challenging group has been seniors, because coming back in April as a senior, you're kind of like, okay, you better have something good for me because I'm getting ready to graduate. But outside of that, we really have seen the uptick, and that you show me don't talk it, show me it's safe, and I'm more willing to come back.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about pre-K. Some districts near me, Madeline Mitchell asks, have cut back on pre-K during the pandemic due to lack of resources. Can we talk about our youngest learners, preschool, K-3, and the fundamental skills that may have been lost this year, like taking turns, expressing emotions in healthy ways, motor skills, language development? She asks, are these losses reversible? How can those students and families be best supported?
Go ahead, Sonja.
No, you can go. I was the last one.
Yeah, so I was going to say, for us in Rhode Island, what we saw, the largest number of students not coming in back to our system were pre-K and kindergarten students, pre-K, K and 1. You know, the younger students, the families were very nervous. And also, I think there's this idea, well, it's only kindergarten, it's only pre-K, you know, I don't have to send them in. And for us, part of our use of the stimulus money is extending pre-K and growing pre-K within our school system and making sure that it's a line item afterwards, because we really understand that this is the base, and that's what we're most worried about, is those kids in those grades coming back in. And then the question is, do they go to kindergarten now? You know, do they go to first grade, even though they didn't have a kindergarten experience or a pre-K experience? And right now we're grappling with that for September in terms of, you know, we're going to get screeners and talk to parents, not just about the academics, but just, you know, exactly what you're talking about, the social emotional piece, the parallel play. Are they still doing that? Are they not? You know, what are those pieces that makes you a successful learner? And does your child have it at this point? And what can we do to support your child?
Okay, thank you so much. And I hate to say it, but we're already out of time. Thank you so much to our speakers, and also Chastity Pratt of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for doing a great job moderating this conversation. Just a couple of quick points before we sign off. To the participants, the audience, you'll get an email next week with an evaluation form. Please complete it. We take our member feedback very, very seriously and use it to improve our offerings. So with that, thank you, everyone.